As I introduced the panel, before we came on, I told them that I would consider it a success if we got into a few arguments up here during this session. And I was, as I got to know them better in the last 10 minutes, I realized that might have actually, I might have hoped that wouldn't come true. It'll be a little too easy to accomplish. This group has known each other for a long time. Sitting next to me is Doug Kaul from Flagship Ventures. We also have JF Formela from Atlas Ventures, Corey Goodman from venBio, Rajiv Kaul, who you may have just seen on CNBC with me a little earlier, from Fidelity, and of course Sue Siegel from GE Ventures. So thank you all so much for coming. I want to dive right into it because our panel has a lot to say, but right before we came on, I looked up some statistics about venture investing in neurology from a bio report that actually just came out. Some of the numbers actually surprised me. Oncology is the biggest class that venture funds have gone into in the last 10 years. From 2004 to 2013, $9.1 billion of venture funding went into oncology. You might be surprised that $4.6 billion went into neurology. Into psychiatry, about $900 million. But for neurology, it's gone down 40% in that time. And the split really between investing in novel drug development and into improving on existing drugs is really about 50-50 in neurology. So it really isn't quite the focus that you see on novel drug development as you see in other therapeutic areas. And so as we kind of look at those stats, I'm interested to hear from you guys. Does that surprise you? And maybe Doug, we'll just start with you. What have your reflections been on the investment environment into neurology and neuroscience?
I think that you can interpret the number in a couple of different ways. I mean, $4 billion or $2 billion for novel drugs is substantial money. But I think that the real implication is that when you think about how that relates to the need or how it relates to oncology, it's really a paltry amount of money. And I think that it's an indication that from the investment viewpoint, I think there's been a general perception over the last decade or decade and a half that there's been really very few toeholds where there's a sufficiently compelling proposition that you think there's going to be a chance we're going to return.
JF, what are your reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the bottom line here is that oncology is in a special place today because there is so much validation of some of those new approaches, particularly immuno-oncology, which is, you know, big sucking sound for financing both at the early stage and later stage. And the fundamental challenge of neurosciences has been that the ability to correlate phenotypes with mechanism of action has been much more difficult than in many other areas, right? So, I mean, I think right now, and we'll talk about that a bit more, I think the focus on genetic disease is helping actually getting a little bit of a beachhead where when you have a monogenic disease and you really understand the mechanism, there is more appetite, even for early-stage investor like us, to actually take a shot. So, you know, but the unbalance doesn't surprise me at all. I think that, you know, CNS is definitely behind in oncology in terms of the maturation of the technology and the validation of the target. But, you know, I think some of us expect that things are going to change in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years. But, you know, we certainly have been more active already, and we anticipate we'll continue to be more active.
Corey, what are your thoughts? As somebody who was in academia working in the space and went into industry, are you optimistic given these numbers?
I'll actually say that I'm surprised the amount of money spent in neurology is as high as it is in the last few years. Look, this is a tough question for me because, as you say, I spent several decades as a neuroscientist. I still am a neuroscientist at heart. And I would love nothing more than to help solve a major neurological disease. That would just be fabulous, and it's true of all of us. Doug's a neurologist. I mean, we share that in common. Yet when I look at venBio, and you know, we've been very successful. The truth is, we haven't made a single what I would call card-carrying neurological investment, and it's not because people don't show me things. It's not because I don't want to. The closest we came was migraine, and even though the symptoms of migraine are maybe neurological, it's a vascular disease. It was an antibody that solves it against CGRP that doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. If that's the closest we got, it tells you something. what we're looking for, what we're all looking for therapeutically, where you can see a target, a drug, you can connect it, not just through animals, but to human validation, where it connects and there's a set of patients where you believe it truly is validated somehow that it's going to work. You see the regulatory path. That's when it's a win-win. And those things don't come very often. It's really hard. Am I an optimist? Sure. But we can talk later. There's some things I see coming along that for some of the things I'm interested in are going to make a difference, but it's been pretty slow.
And Rajiv, as a result of that, what do you see in the public markets to invest in neuroscience?
Well, I think there's pockets of optimism. MS, for example, is an area where you've had tremendous success in the last 10, 15 years. My hope is that in the next 5 to 10 years, Alzheimer's disease will be we'll see some breakthroughs. So I think it's really a function. I think my broader thought process in biotech investing in general has been that in the last decade, you've sort of seen this explosion in understanding of different biology, precision medicine, and that's been combined with, and I've talked to JF a lot about this, and I'm sort of quoting him on this too. There's been this explosion of modalities across different areas, and we're now trying to find different therapeutic areas where we can find these sort of things come together. And so I think there's pockets in the neurosciences where it's occurred today. The excitement in viral diseases, for example, the treatments we've had there, cures for hepatitis C or advancements in HIV, those have been used as proxies for advancements in oncology. You mentioned Gleevec, breakthrough type drugs, and so things don't happen overnight, but I think there's reason to be optimistic that incrementally, if you pick the right areas where you're beginning to understand the biology, you get the right delivery mechanisms to get the right drugs to the right patients, you'll start seeing transformative type results. But it's like everything in biotech. Each drug is different, each patient is different, and one has to sort of keep that in mind and build up from that sort of bottoms-up approach, and that'll grow to a number of different areas over time.
And that brings us to Sue, and I think that's a great thing to focus on, each patient being different, because in imaging, that's enabled us to change the way we look at Alzheimer's. Just in the last couple of years, it's drastically changed the way trials are done. How are you looking at the investment in neuroscience at GE Ventures?
Yeah, glad to comment. First, where's Chris? So Chris, these chairs, I want to show you something. So anyone under 5 feet, you can't reach the back and the floor at the same time. So for the record, so if you guys see me sitting in the front of my chair, there's a reason.
We thought you were just really interested.
I am very interested. So the way we look at it when we think about investing at GE, it really is around the world of diagnostics and devices. So we try to look at it from what I would call, because we don't do therapeutic investing, very much around things that enable this study of the disease. Because when you compare it to cancer, which you started out doing, disease of genetics, there was so much infrastructure built up in cancer, and it was specific to tools, right? The National Cancer Act was declared. Lots of folks came together, and the study of cancer, there was all sorts of tools associated to that, including the Human Genome Project. So hopefully you'll see the same sort of progression, but faster, as it relates to investing in brain. And for a company like GE, we're going to invest more specifically around the tool sets needed to actually understand the disease, such as some of the imaging areas. And then in addition to that, for diagnostic purposes, biomarkers are things that we're interested in. I think the last panel talked about the world of wearables. So looking at that as another phenotype to understand behavior, particularly in behavioral cognitive sort of issues around psychiatric diseases. So we'll look at the tool sets that allow you to actually measure the disease much better on a go-forward basis.
And I should mention, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we do have this Yorn, and we'd love questions. So if you have them, please submit them, and we'll get them in. Corey, I want to go back to something you mentioned. There are areas that make you optimistic, and I'd love to hear from everybody about what looks good in the field right now, and then I want to talk about what still looks bad and how we can fix it.
Sure. So one of the areas, I'll start with something that's getting my juices going lately, and it was something Rajiv mentioned, that one of the problems for example, if you take Alzheimer's and you take all the different drugs for A beta, most of them, I'll talk about antibodies, I like biologics, you take all these antibodies, they don't cross the blood-brain barrier, or maybe 1/10% does. That's kind of a sugar, right? You know, you got all of it in the blood system, you're hoping on this sink hypothesis, and you know, my team, when I used to oversee Renat, you know, very focused on that because you can't get things in. There's a little company that I've been helping to grow called Oceanics. There's also a big company called Genentech and a few others who are working on trying to get biologics in the brain. And lately I've seen data from Oceanics. I know Genentech has published some of theirs, but there is now, I would say for the first time, I believe we can get not only whole antibodies, other large proteins into the brain with actually very good transport using Trojan horse approaches. The transferrin receptor, wonderful ways in the case of Oceanics with little small domain shark antibodies called VNARs. But I'm just incredibly, this is only in the last few months, I'm just impressed with that data. I've been impressed with some Genentech data and thinking, wow, we could finally imagine now starting to at least get biologics into the brain like we've imagined and not just loading up the blood and hoping 1/10% dribbles in. So as someone who likes biologics, that gives me optimism.
That's fascinating. I really want to go more into the mechanisms by which that works, but do other folks have areas that they see that make them optimistic and make you think you might want to invest more? You mentioned some.
So, I mean, I totally share the you know, interest in that we obviously wonderful. I mean, it's next generation modality driven, which, you know, which again, going to how do you actually match the tool to the biology? One area that is fascinating right now is epigenetics regulation of the brain. And you know, neuronal plasticity, we know now, is you know, in large part regulated by epigenetics, and it so turns out that we can actually target epigenetics target. So you know,
maybe tell us a little bit about epigenetics.
So epigenetics essentially is a regulation of transcription by, which turns out to be mostly by non-coding transcript, which is long non-coding RNA, which probably many people in the room are aware of that, but they tend to regulate methylation, demethylation of particular loci. And you can actually target those with a new modality because now we understand small RNA molecule much better than we did. I mean, it was, you know, it took 20 years to really start to understand how to make RNA drugs. And now that we do understand, by and large, how to make RNA drugs, I mean, it's probably as difficult to make that than to make a small molecule, but we can make it. You can actually target particular loci. So one good example is MECP2, which is the gene that actually is responsible for Rett syndrome, which is, you know, form of autism in girls that has attracted a lot of attention. And the reason why it has is because we start to really understand the mechanism, and there might be a way to actually really target in a mechanistic manner the disease. So it's actually interesting because you start to see a bit of a dichotomy in the world of CNS or neuroscience, you know, investing and drug development, where patient foundation will do a lot of what I call phenomenology, which they should do. So, you know, ketamine and Copaxone and IGF-1 has been tried. We don't understand the mechanism. It seems that there is some symptom benefit. And I think that probably someone, maybe the government or the patient foundation should do that. Since we're on an investor panel, I should point out that for us it's a bit more difficult because if you don't understand the mechanism, it's hard for us to invest into a black box. But when we look at the epigenetic regulation of MECP2 and the potential to upregulate the transcription with a mechanism that is very well understood, that to us is investable. So obviously you need to do your homework, and Li Wei-Tsai works at Harvard or MIT on HDAC3, is another example of epigenetic regulation that can lead to benefits. So there are some pockets of a better understanding of mechanism where we actually now we have the modality to actually do translation.
Can I ask Jeff a question? It's great. I love this stuff.
I'm nervous because he's a neuroscientist.
No, yeah, I mean, I see the first applications with certain genetic diseases. How broad do you think that technology is going to go? What sort of range of diseases might you apply to?
So the range of definition, I mean, very good point. So now we're getting a little bit into the science.
Yeah.
Obviously, you need to have an intact copy of a gene if you're going to upregulate transcription.
Right.
If you have, you know, homozygous loss of function, you're going to need to do gene therapy. So now it's actually quite interesting in terms of strategy for funds. Because for us, and I don't know where Doug is on that, but gene therapy We're starting to be interested, but
Same
to
here.
do gene therapy of the brain, we're kind of a little bit cautious.
Yes.
We'd like to see progress not only so the biology is easy here, homozygous loss of function.
Yeah.
The modality is not that easy.
Yeah.
Now, if you have heterozygous and you have an intact copy of the gene, or you have silencing, MECP2 actually, there is a number of patients that have the syndrome and don't have a mutation, but they have silencing of the gene.
So, I mean, you could take the same idea. Can we just have a conversation? Is this okay?
You
You can take
already
the
are.
same idea with gene editing. Do you think we can get gene editing to work for the brain?
Well, I mean, the challenge with, and as you know, we are in gene editing.
I know you are.
As the challenge is going to be very similar to the challenge of delivery in gene therapy.
Right.
So I think that gene editing in the brain, I think it holds enormous promise, but I think we need to make more progress on the modality. And our view as an investor, now it's a total, I wouldn't call it a dogma, but it's a view of how we think about investing into a particular area. I think it's very hard for one venture fund and one company to take on improvement in a modality. I think a modality matures in the open market. It's very hard to say we're going to solve the problem of gene therapy in the brain to then go solve one disease where we understand the biology. I think that the academic community and the world of science should solve the modality problem, and then eventually we all jump in because then we can benefit on the fact that the modality is maturing. So it might be an easy way out, but we are trying to be practical.
And it's funny that you guys just started talking about gene therapy, because our sole question we've received so far is about gene therapy in neurological disease. Oh, we just got another one. And somebody was asking about Parkinson's, but I assume your answer would be the same. Do you guys agree on gene therapy in the brain, about its applications, and trying to basically figure out how to do it first before applying it in specific areas?
Yeah, I would agree with what JF said. The brain creates a couple of obstacles that are far greater than other organs. One is just the heterogeneity of the cell types within the brain, and any of these diseases generally affects just a particular subsets of these cells, certainly neurodegenerative diseases. And so for gene therapy to work conceptually, you're going to have to be able to select that subset of cells, which is not trivial. And of course, the blood-brain barrier, and just a three-dimensional problem of getting material to the right location. So, I think that while there will likely be an impact of that in the fullness of time, what we really need as a field is to get a toehold of success on things where the technical barriers are much lower.
And that leads us to another question we just received, which is what clinical and technology are critical for startups that you look for? So what does a startup need if you're going to think about investing in them? Sue, maybe we can start with you if you're looking in investing in diagnostics.
Sure. So I'm going to take it a little bit different direction for a second on the diagnostics end and devices end of things, because ours are a little bit more concrete, providing the tool sets that allow you to study the disease, which clearly, as you were talking about it, this village, this environment, this ecosystem has to get built up in order to be able to study the diseases more, particularly the mechanisms of disease. So what we try to look for is, we're trying to do a lot non-invasively, and clearly imaging has taken the lead in that particular area. We're also, this is investment internally, and then I'll talk about what we're investing in externally for 2 seconds. We're also doing a sort of a novel model around utilizing some of the contrast agents in our, what we call our neuroincubator, to work with the academic community, to come together to start to validate some of the uses associated to these in the applications, like with tau as an example, so that you get much better, higher resolution in some of the indications and diseases that you would look at. And we're doing that so that you can get a much better view of what, and much higher resolution of what in fact is happening there. We've also got in development a head-only scanner. So one of the things that has happened, and so we look for this externally too, is make things ubiquitous, make them cheaper, and make them easy to use, and they don't disrupt too much of the flow as it relates to whoever your target audience is, be it academics or if it's a clinician. You're not taking money out of their pockets, but you're actually making it part of the workflow. So when you think about the world of brain, part of the difficulty is accessing imaging technology so you can in fact study it really, really well. So if we've got a head-only scanner in development that we're very excited about, to say the least, with great resolution. If you can make that so it's very accessible, so now you have it in clinics, so that you can have it in clinical trials and much more accessible to the research community, to this village that you're talking about. Now you have a more ubiquitous tool versus the bigger machines that we also make to be able to now study the disease. So we look for non-invasive, we look for better resolution, we look for tool sets that, in fact, because we don't have the complications within the mechanisms per se, that allow you to actually help elucidate what everyone's sort of looking for. And they can be from using ultrasound probes as an example, all the way through to the bigger machines and then some of the reagents and tools that we can actually provide. So from an investing perspective, those kind of tool sets are actually quite important to us.
And from the therapeutic side, maybe Doug, we'll start with you. What do you look for? What does a company need to have, a startup need to have in order for you to consider investing?
I think that the real gating issue in this field in general is understanding of the disease. And if we can become convinced that a disease is sufficiently well understood, that there's the kind of mechanistic insight that is the basis for a rational therapeutic strategy, we certainly need to understand that the modality that would be required to accomplish that strategy is viable, and so on. And there are issues, that are very important about regulatory pathway, the size of the trials, and all of that. But the real place is at the level of the understanding of disease. And I do think that there's some small but very encouraging examples of this. SMA, which I think a few people have spoken about, and Corey and I have been involved in one of the foundations in a nonprofit context, has really stood out as a disease which 10 years ago was identified but not well understood, and now there's multiple drugs in the clinic. So that's an example of what's possible, and I think that we're starting to see that with some of the subsets of syndromes which are larger but comprise probably multiple diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, et cetera.
And do you guys feel similarly? Would you have a similar answer in what a startup needs?
Yeah. We talked, just to make a quick parenthesis on SMA, but which is a very active field right now, but it seems to me that the biology has been understood for quite some time. Essentially loss of function in SMN1, and everybody has, or most people have some intact copy of SMN2, but you have a splicing issue, and the question is, how do you actually correct splicing? It turns out that RNA companies, probably were the ones that were best fitted to do that, and we basically have been able to evolve the technology enough that you can actually correct splicing. What's potentially even more interesting, I'm a bit biased, is to actually not only correct splicing, but to increase transcription of SMN2, which one of our companies is doing, which is very exciting. And in fact, what we've observed is that the combination of a transcription correcting oligos with a splicing correcting oligo is more active in the models than either one. So one thing I would also say in neuroscience is that, particularly maybe for genetic disease, going back to having tractability on the understanding of the disease, is that it's going to be very interesting to see how companies are developing those products, because single agent therapy for a number of those diseases, and SMA in my opinion is a good example, is probably not going to be the best in class treatment. So, to me a good example is Vertex and HCV. Everybody thought, and they thought, that telaprevir would be single agent, first agent best in class. It's not how it worked out. And I think that companies that are developing intervention in SMA should be looking at who else is doing what and understanding what might be the best combos, and you want to plan in a strategic way. Going back to the more general question, I think that totally understanding the biology and having modalities that are mature enough that they're tractable so that you can have a development program is the two ingredients. I totally agree with Doug. Those are the two fundamental ingredients we're looking at.
We're getting a lot of questions from the audience. I want to take some of them. I'm surprised we only have 15 minutes left, but a lot of questions about where funding is coming from and should come from. One here on national brain research funding, like the Brain Initiative and the European Human Brain Project. What is their ROI impact on brain research?
All of these things are great because, and funding for people with ideas and entrepreneurs is going to come from a lot of different places. You know, there are many times that all of us are giving friends and for issues that we care about, advice about you're not going to get the money from the venture community now. You've got to go to disease foundations, to angels. You have to be part of some very lean kind of incubator, and you really have to kind of gut it out for a couple of years because you're not going to get venture funding on hopes and prayers. When it's something that's going to get our juices going is, and just repeating what these guys have been saying, is when you can see that there is a drug candidate, there is a target that you connect through animals, through human validation to disease, to a group of patients, to a regulatory approval. That's a lot to say, but SMA, we can say that now. Why is everything going crazy with immuno-oncology right now? Because we can see paths of how to save lives, and all that alphabet soup we grew up with, CD this and CD that, suddenly it has come alive, and we have the tools, we see the cell types, what to influence. You have to get some sort of neurological disease to a point where we can see the path. We can't fund science experiments. So all that other funding is fabulous. You know, even California, my state, is now coming up with some funding. All of it is great because there is that valley between your idea or some laboratory experimental result and getting to the point where one of us and our partners are going to say, you know, this is a fundable project.
Now, Rajiv, I want to ask you a question about sort of the public investing approach to neuroscience. When you're looking at companies, I mean, we're talking a lot about immuno-oncology, and you see the valuations of those companies just going through the roof, from the small ones to the big ones. What do you see in terms of the expectation that neuroscience-focused companies will succeed? I mean, obviously you have Biogen's very big companies, but smaller companies as well. Do investors think that those are good bets?
Meg, I don't know the answer to that. It's just very difficult for me to generalize across sort of public investing in neurosciences. You know, I go back to what we talked about earlier. It depends on a specific disease. If you understand SMA, you have a chance of getting a real drug there. And you probably should think seriously about investing in there as a public investor if you get the right vehicle. I think my personal view is that the line between traditional public and private investing is really moved. And I think it's moved because I think, you know, traditionally when you think of public investors, you're thinking about late-stage investors with a different risk profile. But I think what really drives all of this is the probability of success. And as you get better genetics and better understanding of disease pathways and better ways to image them and detect patients and get them early, the probabilities of success and selective indications should move early. And so I think that's what, you know, we've been actively doing and pursuing, is that, you know, sort of chasing the probability of success, which is a function of all of what we've discussed today. And I think that should be good because what it means is that the large capital of, you know, pools of capital in public markets should now be more accessible to pioneering venture capitalists. And I think a general challenge for the industry in the last 15 years has been the cost of capital has just simply been too high. You know, I met Francis Collins yesterday, and he was saying that the NIH, the actual on a pricing power basis, NIH funding is down 23% in the last 5 years. And today, researchers, you know, 1 in every 6 grants are getting funded. It's sort of the worst time it's ever been in US history for NIH funding of basic research, which is a real tragedy.
That's a tragedy.
And you know, when you talk about big pharmaceutical companies, they're getting rewarded for cutting back on their costs. When you look at some of the companies that the stock market's rewarding, they're sort of buying older drugs and cutting all the research and cutting all the selling expenses. You know, so you've got this sort of environment in which the innovation is really moving very rapidly, probably never been better. At the same time, the cost of capital has also been really, really high. So for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to have access to capital, I think this presents a great opportunity and to partner with a lot of the entrepreneurs in really building some of these next generation neuroscience companies. But again, it's going to be selective. It's going to be where the biology is most advanced. Though I say that, and I was just thinking about your comment on the immuno-oncology companies. I owned Medarex and Organogenesis, some of these companies, you know, and people did not believe in immuno-oncology for the longest time. And then, that changed. And I think a lot of drug development didn't understand. A lot of drug development, despite our understanding of science, is also unknown. And it comes through experimentation and learning through that. So my hope is we'll be surprised in the next few years. I think people don't really believe broadly that we can have an Alzheimer's drug that could be game-changing, or a set of drugs that could be game-changing. But if it happens, sorry.
I was just going to, the immuno-oncology thing, what's amazing, I was at Berkeley as a neuroscientist. Jim Allison made the fundamental discovery, published it in Science in 1996. He'll get the Nobel Prize, I think most of us would predict, all of us, in the next few years, and yet nobody took him seriously, right? And Medarex wound up with anti-CTLA-4 through a very circuitous route. It went through 3 or 4 companies before then, and that whole first wave all comes from small biotechs, people who had to believe. And there's probably in the neurology space right now people who aren't being taken seriously, the next Jim Allison, who have the kernel of some fundamental discovery there, right?
Well, we've got new models, right, that are really making progress in terms of either foundations, which we've all talked about, the CCF Foundation, for example, and a number of the patient advocacy groups coming in to fund this research and then making sure through different mechanisms, giving it back to the actual companies. The other thing is, and I think we all said it, this notion of partnership, like it or not, where it used to be just one company that tried, it's going to have to be many. And the notion of how we're going to handle IP and the kind of information sharing that has to occur now in very quick order, because we actually have the tools to do that, has to actually enable some of this risk-taking that the venture community is being very, very careful about, for FDA reasons, for reimbursement reasons in particular, because of cost. So really, all of us have to sort of come together in a consortium model to be able to start encouraging, if you'd like, some of this risk-taking early on.
We are getting so many questions, I actually can't keep up with all of them, but one, to change direction just a little bit, somebody asks about prevention in neurodegenerative diseases, and is continuous passive monitoring possible? Sue, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, there's a number of companies out there, Ginger.io, et cetera, that do passive monitoring, and right now, we're being passively monitored by our iPhone, by the way. Or whatever device that you have, right?
Maybe the government.
And what they're starting to talk about is these wearables, or using the data that is actually being collected to start to correlate those to your behaviors, so that in fact you can understand if you're at risk for depression or other types of neurodiseases. So yes, it is part of the whole sort of treatment modality, if you'd like, that you are going to be looking at not only, and it was said again in the other panel that was a little earlier, was you're not only looking at the actual drug or therapy, be it neuromodulation, whatnot, but you're also looking to measure and monitor anywhere, anytime, utilizing some of these passive devices.
Does anybody else have any other thoughts on prevention? JF, you made a funny face when I asked the question.
I mean, yeah, it's wonderful, but as an early stage venture capitalist, I mean, investing in prevention has some major challenges, I mean, and Doug covered those, which is, I'd like to see the design of the phase 3 trial, and and then
the longitudinal trial.
It certainly has an intuitive appeal, but I would keep coming back to if you show me a disease that is understood, I'll show you a way to conceive of a company. And I think that the other problem, aside from the fact that it could be very expensive, is, okay, let's say that you knew somebody's about to get Alzheimer's disease. We still don't know what to do about it. We may be on the cusp, and I'm hopeful that we are, but at this point we aren't.
I think something very interesting was said at one of the panels yesterday, and I think actually was with George Kangos and a couple of other folks, and talking about prevention, where someone made the analogy with cardiovascular disease, where 30, 40 years ago, the treatment was mostly symptomatic, and in fact, people would get a heart attack, they would go into an ICU, and people would just watch, and watch to see the unfolding of complication, and then try to have symptomatic treatment of the complication. And then, of course, you fast forward 34 years, now, and we're essentially managing biomarkers. And so it's a very different paradigm. So it's pretty clear, and in fact, I think they mentioned AD and some other neurodegenerative disease, that at one point, once the biology is much better understood, and then the imaging and the biomarkers are really enabling you to actually monitor prevention or early stage treatment, I think then it becomes very interesting, but it's really not something that, in my opinion, is ready for early stage investing. I think it's probably a great area for GE and maybe some large pharma company working with large cohort of patients, doing epidemiology, maybe population genetics. But there is a lot of infrastructure work to be done before it's actionable, at least in my opinion.
We have a question here about psychiatric disorders, something we haven't talked about as much on the panel. The question is, what's the best way to bring drugs to market for psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, where the patient is too sick to work and uninsured, while the prevalence is 1% with a huge burden on society? Yeah. How are you guys looking at psychiatric disorders? I mean, we have some stats on this. It's very, very small numbers being invested in psychiatry in venture funding, about $900 million between 2004 and 2013.
They are really hard. And I'm sure everyone in the audience knows it. I mean, everyone has enormous compassion in that area, but by and large, if you don't really understand mechanism, and in many cases there may even have been developmental, wiring and migration defects or whatever, it's very hard. You can alleviate symptoms, you can perhaps restore some function symptomatically, but I think you're hearing all of us and the desire to get at mechanism of disease. And so far, those breakthroughs haven't yet come in many of these psychiatric.
Do you get a sense that in the academic setting, there's a focus on psychiatric disorders as much as there is on things like Alzheimer's disease?
Well, there's been a lot of really good human genetics in the last couple of years, and I think that, to me, maybe I show my prejudice, I think that's where some of the breakthroughs are going to come. There's been by common variants, I like certain approaches, but rare variant analysis, there are different genetic ways to do it. But the bottom line is that some of these genetic associations, I think, are going to give us the first inroads. And remember, that's the way we got the first inroad to Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't that many decades ago, Alzheimer's disease was really considered a psychiatric disease. It was a cognitive disease. Then we got the group of genetic patients that turned us to A-beta, and the rest is now history. And we all have some optimism that it may be a solvable problem. We need those kinds of genetic insights into some of these psychiatric diseases to get us to mechanism.
I think it's a fundamental issue in neuroscience in my mind, which is the ways of human genetics and population genetics is going. I think clearly is going to give us some starting point and beachhead. The potential challenge that some diseases will tend to be more monogenic, and some diseases are going to be multigenic and totally heterogeneous.
Yep.
And that's going to take quite some time for the academic community to actually figure out the subtype biologically, not phenotypically, because you actually can't distinguish the subtype phenotypically. So to the extent that then the biology is better established and mature, then it gives us, early stage investor, a path to pick maybe one gene and one subpopulation and then start there. And then it creates a beachhead that can actually start to expand.
And Meg, can I just comment on that beachhead for a second? Because as you improve, particularly as we continue to get better and better and more resolution in genetics, if you can really connect that to the world of imaging as another phenotype, right? So now you have this world of radiogenomics. You can start to, as both of them said, this subsetting and also the targeting more specifically with regards to correlations between the morphology and also the genetics, that helps you get it a little bit closer. So, I mean, you probably saw that there's an announcement, there was an announcement around the Francis Collins Personalized Medicine Initiative or Precision Medicine Initiative, and they're talking about 1 million patient cohort or 1 million population cohort. And they're talking about not only genetics, but actually putting a whole bunch of different measures in this. And if you look at the UK Biobank, which has already done, I'm forgetting the number, so don't quote me on this, but thousands and thousands overall, they've taken not only genomes, but they've also taken images along with a number of different parameters. So this complexity is all based on information, and you hear it in every disease, and it's the same type of sequence that goes on in understanding very complex, what we used to think monogenic disease is very easily understood. start to subset into, look at the leukemias. We thought there were 2, and then all of a sudden there's 60 plus. So it gives you a sense of how complex the world of brain is going to be.
We're almost done, so I want to end on something that we talked about in discussions before the panel, which I think there were some comparisons to neurology being where cancer was, what would you say, 20 years ago? Farther back, in the 70s. It's much farther back. That's true. So maybe quick answers from everybody, yes or no. I mean, are you optimistic that this far out for neurology will have made the same progress as we have made since then in cancer?
I'm very optimistic. I think that it feels to me that the sort of general level of understanding of many of these diseases is roughly where we were, I think, actually about 20 years ago in oncology when things really started to break open. There's some important differences between neurologic diseases and cancer in terms of proliferation versus degeneration and time course and so on. But I think that the knowledge base and the tools to augment that knowledge base are taking off now. And so that makes me actually very, very optimistic and looking seriously at opportunities to invest in this area.
Yes.
Wonderful. Corey?
Yes, and if you pull lots of things we've heard, and, you know, from altering gene expression and editing and all these new technologies, if we can get those to the right set of neurons, I think we have a great chance. And we may be 20 years behind, but it's not going to take 20 years to get there.
Which is
I
important
think we'll
because
pick
we've
up
got
the
to
pace.
solve this a lot faster
Yep.
than that. Rajiv?
So I would say yes, I'm very optimistic, and I frame it for 2 reasons, both of which are sort of qualitative. The first is when I first, in 1995, when I first started investing in biotech, Sloan Kettering in myeloma, a patient goes to Sloan Kettering, 60 years of age. The average life expectancy is 3 to 5 years. You go to Sloan Kettering today, and there were 5 clinical trials, and most of them were chemo drugs. Same thing for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Sloan Kettering today, multiple myeloma. The average life expectancy is 18 years. There's 45 clinical trials ongoing, and they're mostly novel therapies. That's a very optimistic reason that's my one reason to be optimistic. And it wasn't obvious. People didn't really understand the biology at the time, and they did understand some of it, but there was a lot of learning that came along the way, and we had some great results. So I'm hoping that there's going to be pockets in the neurosciences where we're going to see that kind of dramatic progress in the next decade. And the second sort of anecdotal thing I would say is a summation of looking at just the industry broadly, and I like to call it sort of Biotech 3.0, the next 10 years. The first 10 years, 85, you know, the first 10, 15 years was enzyme protein replacement therapies. The next sort of decade was antibodies. But today, in this third generation, the third sort of 3.0, you know, you've got those modalities, but then you've got this whole explosion of other modalities and an explosion in biotech. So maybe one way to think about it would be if it took 20 years to get some of those drugs to market, you know, Rituxan, Herceptin, the TNFs, maybe it'll take half the time this time around. You know, there's some sort of functional relationship there, but so I'll leave it at that.
And Sue?
I'm a yes, and I have to say that a number of reasons. One is the urgency for the world is upon us, and that creates an economic reason for people to care. So it's not just a personal health reason, there's an economic competitive advantage for countries when you start to get these neurodegenerative diseases really taking people out of the workforce. Number 2 is governments care now because of that. And so you've got big government spend, not enough, but big government spend coming together to actually help get the right sort of infrastructure, right sort of ecosystem in place so that we can take earlier risk. Number 3 is even these convenings where we're bringing together all sorts of different disciplines so that there is more awareness. I mean, that's progress in and of itself. So my sense is it's here. The convergence of the tool sets are here. We have a path. We understand it based on cardiology and the world of oncology on how we got to some of these successes. So we've got models now to take down and say, okay, we can do this. So yeah, I'm with everybody else.
It's a good note to end on. Thank you so much to our panel.